I'm delighted to be here. I work in FAO, based in Rome, in headquarters. And to begin, I would like to acknowledge my two colleagues, McDaid Kapetsky, who is a FAO Aquaculture Senior Officer, now retired, and my colleague Jenness. He's a GIS expert consultant. They're both based in the US, and together we have worked on this specific topic. So, clearly and without doubt, and as Alessandro mentioned previously, one of the key challenges in the world, is, and especially anywhere in the world, is the issue about space. Now, clearly, 2.4 billion extra people will obviously occupy our world. Obviously, we're decreasing the amount of space that is available. And so this is obviously one of the many articles that has been released recently, talking specifically about the problems with space. Clearly, there's an increase on stress on freshwater resources. It also is another indication of the need for space, of the issue of competition, of the need for moving, for example, in the case of aquaculture, for moving further off the coast, perhaps to decrease that great pressure on freshwater resources. And so, satisfying the demand for food from aquaculture will largely depend on the availability of space for aquaculture. Now, assessing opportunities for the global development of offshore mariculture. There's four key questions that I want you to think about. In other words, what species in culture systems are most appropriate for offshore mariculture? Where? Would you think of where are the best locations, are best or optimal for offshore mariculture? Is it in the tropics? Is it at the temperate? Exactly where? About how much offshore mariculture is actually needed to meet the demand for food? And when do we expect this growth to occur? This is some of the key questions that were raised when we started to think about space issues for offshore mariculture. And so the contents of my presentation are to provide you a summary of the status of inshore mariculture, that is, statistics that are provided to FAO, to provide spatial estimates for offshore mariculture at a global scale, to give you an insight into new opportunities for the development of offshore mariculture. I'll talk a little bit about climate change, and there's the recent initiatives of spatial planning for offshore mariculture, and then I'll make some conclusions at the end. Okay, two publications have been recently released. They're outside on the corridor, and here's both of them. The first one here is a workshop proceedings. The workshop on offshore mariculture took place in Orbatello in 2010, and the workshop actually dealt with looking at technical, environmental, spatial, and governance challenges. Now, it contains a series of reviews on these topics, and it contains a thin synthesis. I highly recommend looking at this work. It was conducted in 2009, it was discussed in 2010, and it was eventually published in 2013. Accompanying that workshop report, we produced also another document, which is a technical publication that deals explicitly on spatial analysis to estimate offshore mariculture. So this publication is also available as a hard copy outside. It was produced also during 2009, 2010, and it was eventually published in 2013. And it is the foundation of those two publications that are the basis of this presentation. And so, obviously, my presentation is very simple, very brief, and all the details are contained in these two publications. We also have a CD-ROM that contains both publications. So for those of you who do not have a lot of luggage space to carry these, you can take the CD-ROM, also available outside, and you will be able to look at all the details. I would also like to mention in this first publication that it contains two parts. One of them is looking at estimates of offshore mariculture, but it contains a second important part. This is why I'm talking here, because it contains a section on the use of remote sensing satellite imagery for offshore mariculture. And obviously that's a very interesting topic that is very relevant for offshore mariculture. So it also contains that section too. Okay, so looking at the status of inshore mariculture. In other words, what are the statistics from countries informing FAO? Well, if we look at this global map, and if we also look at the kilometers of coastline in relation to the production reported for mariculture, we can see some interesting things here. We can see that in terms of impact, you can see that in red, of course, the most intense use for mariculture is, for example, in China, and the orange colors, for example, in Europe or in Chile. So you can see the impact, but more interestingly, you can see that in these countries also, for example, in Asia, of course, and in Chile, there are also opportunities also for offshore mariculture because they have the know-how, they have the relevant species, they have the capacity to do so. But what I would also like to highlight is that there are also many countries who have coasts who are not yet producing mariculture. And so you see all those countries highlighted in yellow color. So clearly there are also opportunities for many other countries to look into offshore mariculture if they want to do so. And so what does the present status of inshore mariculture indicate about its future potential for offshore mariculture? Well, we can conclude a few key things here. We can say that nearly all present-day mariculture takes place in sheltered areas, not offshore. We say that 270,000 kilometers of coastline along which mariculture is not yet practiced. Among the 90 nations and territories already practicing mariculture, 53% produce less than 1 ton per kilometer. 44% of maritime nations and territories are not yet practicing mariculture, so clearly there are ample opportunities. Now, if we look now at the spatial analysis around the globe, if we look at the spatial estimates for offshore mariculture, where is it most likely to develop? So this is the first key question. And clearly, one key framework, at least at present, is that we're looking at the exclusive economic zones, and that is 370 kilometers. And that was taken in this study as our baseline, as our study area. And so you see that in this global map, the areas highlighted in blue, they represent the exclusive economic zones, that is 370 kilometers. So that is our framework for the study that we developed. The other question is which species? That's the second question that we're doing. So which species are more favorable, have more favorable conditions for growth? We looked at blue mussel, Atlantic salmon, and we also looked at integrated mariculture. Now, we looked at these species for a number of reasons. One, because they have a good market potential, because they have obviously well-established markets, because they have already well-established technologies. But they're also representative for climate zones. So in this particular case, they're species in the temperate region. And we also looked at cobia. And clearly that's also an interesting species with great potential, and that has great potential on the tropics. So these are the species that we selected, and then we selected the optimal temperature thresholds. For mussel, you can see the temperature ranges, likewise for Atlantic salmon and for cobia. And these are the temperatures that were selected as being optimal. Now, we then used satellite remote sensing data and conducted all sorts of spatial analysis to estimate the near future offshore mariculture. Now, for cobia, and you can see this map, it represents the temperature range, and within that red boundary, you can see that clearly within that temperature range, clearly it's well within the tropical zones. And it's a good representation of cobia, and most likely, or clearly a representation of other species that have similar temperature ranges. We also looked at blue mussel, we looked at temperature and chlorophyll, and for that, we found potential in, as we would expect, in the temperate regions, both in the north and the south of the globe. Now that was species. We also looked at culture systems, and we looked at cages, and we looked at long lines. And then we then looked at the thresholds that were most optimal for these culture systems. For cages and long lines, we saw that the range of 25 to 100 meters was optimal. Now, please remember that this study was conducted in 2009. There's some updates to that. And for both fish cages and long lines, we saw that current speed, again, as we found in 2009, was optimal from 10 to 100 centimeters per second. Also, using satellite data, we looked at the current speed on the map, and you can see the green areas there, where most of the current speed, at least at a global scale, is really not a problem, except if you go to the northern and southern regions of the globe, where current speeds are more variable or too strong. But at least at that scale, it doesn't seem to be a problem. In terms of water depth, of course, you can see the areas here too. They seem to be optimal in Southeast Asia. Of course, if we had more time, we could zoom in and I could show you the different regions. But you can clearly see in the green color the optimal areas where 25 to 100 meters are shown. Now, the other question was, where and when will offshore mariculture first develop? Now, one of the key points is the issue of proximity. This is a port, and remember that I showed you the graph on the exclusive economic zones, and that distance is 370 kilometers. But the feasible distance from a study from an author called Yin in 2008, from an economic viewpoint, from a profitable viewpoint, he says that 47 kilometers is the optimal economic distance. Again, this is a study in 2008. I'd be very interested in seeing an update to this. And so then, based on the distance range and the proximity to a port, in other words, the proximity to a location where it can provide not only onshore support facilities, but also a location where you can obviously market your products, is a distance of 47 kilometers. And based on that, we produced this global map, and here in red color, you will see the areas within 47 kilometers in proximity to a port. And it was using a world port database, and this is what we got. Now, the other question was, how much, if we integrate this information from species and from culture systems, how much offshore potential is there actually available globally? So what we got, and again, this is a summary and the details are in the publication. We looked at the global area, and we can see here the three aquatic species, cobia, Atlantic salmon, and blue mussel, and integrated multi-trophic aquaculture. You can see that in red color, there are the area estimates for the areas that are 25 nautical miles from a port. And behind in blue, you will see the areas that are within the exclusive economic zones. And you can also see the number of nations in comparison to that, and you can see that there are plenty of nations for the three fish species and for integrated multi-trophic aquaculture. Now, the estimates that I presented here to you were verified through a number of ways. One of them was through comparing the estimates with national production, and the other one was with comparing with actual locations of offshore cages. So there was a lot of verification done to make sure that our estimates were accurate at a global scale. And of course, a lot of the verification was done using also satellite imagery, such as Google Earth. And so, what is the near future offshore mariculture potential? And by all means, I think the future is bright. I think there are large areas globally for the development of offshore mariculture. This summary table here, and I'm only going to highlight one thing, that if we only look at these three species, cobia, salmon, and blue mussel, and if we explicitly look at the optimal areas where they can be grown, if we look at a 5% of this area, we can see that in 5,000 square kilometers, we can produce 50 million tons. Now, that is significant. If you remember the table that Alessandro produced, if that compares to the estimate of mariculture for 2012, in total, we produced 43 million tons. So clearly, even at a very small percentage, there's without doubt, without question, there's a huge potential for offshore mariculture. There are new opportunities that we're looking into. We know that we are increasing in depth. I'm sure that those in the technical session will inform us about that. And clearly that will further expand the potential that I just showed you. We're also looking into integrated mariculture. We're looking into macroalgae. We're starting to look into mapping and estimating the potential for that. We're also looking into climate change. We know that obviously you need to make sure that that's taken into account. We know that temperatures will increase. This is the global map from the IPCC. Now, clearly there's a need for allocation of space. The estimates that I provide were explicitly for offshore mariculture, but without question, you then need to look at the spatial estimates, the spatial allocation of other activities, not only mariculture. These are some maps of different activities in the Rhode Island Ocean, just to show you obviously the integration and the spatial allocation of different sectors. Spatial planning, I mentioned that before. At the subcommittee in aquaculture in Russia last October, there was a very strong consensus of the need for spatial planning to better allocate our resources. So this is a document that was produced. Governance is a key issue, and I'm sure that ocean policy will also address that. At least in Europe, in March 2013, the Commission launched a framework for marine spatial planning and for integrated coastal management. So in Europe, at least, there's a very strong impetus for spatial planning. In the US, there's been, of course, all sorts of complications. But at least from the Gulf, it is my understanding that they are moving forward. And so what I'm trying to highlight here is a need to make sure that government, that policy, obviously supports the development of offshore mariculture. There is the UNESCO Marine Spatial Planning Initiative, and that's taking place in various parts of the world. But the issue here is to make sure that there is consultation with relevant stakeholders from different sectors. And you can do this either in hard copy paper with the different sectors. And there are also new technologies. There's touchable, I don't know if you have seen them, but there's now touchable tables where they bring stakeholders and you can actually discuss and consult the allocations of mariculture eventually with this touch table, which makes it very dynamic and interesting. And so, obviously, the UNESCO Marine Spatial Planning Initiative is something of interest, and there are many tools to address this. So, we now conclude, and we can clearly say that we can have a good idea on the types of species and culture systems at a global scale. We have an indication where it can occur. You're welcome to see the publications. We also have an indication of about how much, at least an indication. And we have an idea of about when, based on current technology. There are new opportunities. I know that for Norway, and I'm sure this is going to be presented later, for new types of cages which can be located at greater depths. This one in particular can go down to 300 meters, and it's in an experimental stage. And without doubt, climate change is a crucial and key consideration for spatial planning. This is a website from the oceans, and it clearly indicates the changes that will occur. It is imperative that the aquaculture sector engages with other sectors and vice versa. Marine spatial planning, for example, plans are occurring for sectors like shipping, but they are doing it in isolation and not in integration with other sectors. And so without question, it is imperative that when we do our studies on offshore marine culture, we make sure we also integrate other relevant sectors. And so I would like to conclude just to say that clearly and without doubt, the future that we want is to develop sustainable development for offshore mariculture. And we want to do that using the ecosystem approach to aquaculture, with marine spatial planning strategies. Ultimately, through a blue growth initiative, we would like to make offshore mariculture to be long-term sustainable and to provide long-term benefits. And my last point is that it is crucial now to implement and to find strategies to implement spatial planning. In this particular case, there is an initiative from the European Commission. It's called Horizon 2020. There's a call for optimizing space for European aquaculture. There's a proposal that has been submitted, and in it, it will include offshore mariculture. So hopefully, the winner of that proposal will be able to provide tools and know-how and capacity building, as has been mentioned. And with that, I would like to